This is the Bema Podcast with Marty Solomon. I'm his co-host, Brent Billings. Today, we are joined by Josh Bossé to set up the narrative of God's story as a contrast between Empire and Shalom.
Mm-hmm. This is one of the fun, foundational conversations for our journey. This is a gateway, a flag point. I'm just making up things at this point. What am I trying to say? It's a marker.
A flag point.
It's a marker, a checkpoint. That's what I'm trying to say. You know what I'm trying to say.
This is, an inflection point.
This is an important conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah, really open your ears for this one, because if you miss this idea, a lot of the journey ahead, you'll be missing out on it. Because this is a foundational idea for Bema.
Absolutely.
It will come up again, so I don't think anyone's going to miss it necessarily, but this is a good one to understand, yes.
So we should do a little quick recap, like we do, especially at the beginning of our journey here. God creates this universe, this cosmos, this world, says it's good, says it's tov meod, invites the people in the story to trust this story, to trust that it's good, to trust that God is for it, to trust what they're learning about who this God is. If they will trust this story, it's going to set them free for what they were made to do, which is to partner with God, to care and steward and protect this creation. And of course, that's a struggle for the preface, what we called Genesis 1 through 11. But then we got into the intro. It's what we're in now. We're learning about this family of God, that demonstrates what it means to trust the story. Even in the midst of mistakes and struggle, it's a dysfunctional family. This family of God is a dysfunctional family. But they've got things like hospitality. They've got their sights set on love. They practice a form of self-sacrifice, lifting others up and their needs. They've experienced forgiveness, and that took us right to the end of Genesis. That was the end of the intro, the preface being Genesis 1 through 11, the intro being 12 through 50, learning about the story of the family of God. And we could have just flowed right into Exodus, but we wanted to take a pause, a break, and note the ending of the introduction and the beginning of what we're going to call God's narrative. Like, God has a story. And the story really starts here in the book of Exodus. Like, the story starts with God's narrative of deliverance, a narrative of Exodus. And that's really a story that God's going to tell from Exodus to Revelation. It's the story that God's going to tell in Jesus. It's the story of Exodus, the story of new birth, of new creation, of deliverance. And so we took a pause last week in our last episode to look at 3 stories of God's wrath. Seemed like a good time to kind of utilize the break to be like, okay, well, wait a minute. We've been talking about a God of love, a God of love, a God of love. What about a story where God's going to kill all the babies? What about a story of like Sodom and Gomorrah? What about the story of like Noah and the flood? So we looked at those. We looked at what we could learn about God. Are these stories? These are stories of wrath. Are they stories of terror? Or, Josh, what was our other option? If they're not stories of terror, what could we be seeing here?
We could be seeing love at work.
Yeah, a God that's committed to the other, a God that's committed to the folks that find themselves on the outside or the underbelly. It might not be God's terror. It might be God's love that's driving this corrective discipline. So today we're going to look at a macro. We're going to step back. We're going to kind of look at take a macro level look at the story itself. We want to understand Egypt, not just as a work of history, although we'll have fun with that by the time we're done, I promise. We want to not just look at Egypt academically, thinking about its physicality or its historical reality. We also want to look at Egypt as a metaphor, because Egypt can also serve as a picture of something else. And it's going to be where we start to talk about this theme of empire versus shalom. Empire versus shalom, as Josh said, going to be a foundational way that we're going to frame the conversation.
And actually, this is a little bit unusual for us, but today's conversation is going to be driven by 3 videos from Ray Vandelon. Hopefully, we're going to give you enough of it that you don't have to go get those videos, but boy, the visuals are so helpful. And like, especially if you have a discussion group where you can, if you want to split up the cost of the DVD or something, there's actually digital copies available now. You can get them that way as well. So you can stream them, quote unquote. I don't know what the deal is behind the scenes, but you don't have to buy a physical DVD. So there are options if you want to do that, especially as a group. It would be beneficial for sure.
You are not going to regret making the decision to watch the videos if you get an opportunity. It will be well worth your time. They're going to come from volume 8. They're the first 3 videos of the volume called God Heard Their Cry. And so we're just going to kind of go over those things. When we used to do this with college students, we would watch these videos in discussion group and really kind of pull them apart that way. And it was time well spent. But we're going to kind of let that drive the conversation here. First video is called How Big is Our God? That was the title of the lesson, How Big is Our God? And really what RVL was doing there, RVL is shorthand for Ray Vander Laan, for all of us that got to learn under him. He talks about 2 narratives. There's a biblical narrative and there's the Egyptian narrative. We've been studying the biblical narrative. There's order out of chaos, like God speaks, and that order is tov. It's tov, it's tov, it's tov meod. It's good. This order is good. And then that order, it does, if you're reading Genesis 1 through 11, that order does descend kind of back into chaos. It starts as chaos. God speaks order out of chaos, good order out of chaos. And then that order kind of starts to devolve back towards chaos. But the premise of the biblical narrative is that it's God that brings this order. Like first and foremost, God establishes this good order. Now, the Egyptian narrative, there are some parallels. Josh, are you familiar with the Egyptian narrative enough? You could speak to some of the parallels between the Egyptian narrative. You're like, hey, these are kind of the same story, and yet they're fundamentally different.
Oh, yeah. The parallels between the Egyptian creation narrative and that first, Genesis 1 creation narrative are, they're astounding. They're also like very clearly intentional. You have the God standing over the chaotic darkness and emerging into it as the light. So in the kind of first divergence would be that in the Egyptian narrative, it's, you might have heard of like Ra, the sun god. Like there's a huge association between the sun and the chief deity, kind of no matter at what time you're looking at Egyptian stuff. Actually, I probably shouldn't say that. I don't know. I don't know enough to say that with certainty, but that is quite often the center. So in the Egyptian narrative, God is the source of light. And then we have the same like separating of waters. And then crucially, to me, the big image is I've seen that in some versions of the story when Pharaoh pulls like out of this like swampy, icky, dark water land, instead of it just being dry land, it's like a pyramid specifically. Then from there, the narrative becomes like Ra creating his own like divine children that fill the heavens. And then everything else after that happens on earth is kind of just an accidental byproduct. Like one of the stories I saw said that the tears of joy from Ra's eyes after seeing his beautiful children filling the heavens fell to earth. And that's where people came from. And so it's like humanity is an afterthought. We are just little bugs scurrying around trying not to get stepped on by Ra. And this symbol of the pyramid as like the base of the gods and then like the source of stability. And I know I've heard you teach about this, about the cartouche and the space that's opened up. But that all those things revolve around this idea of that like God is not on your side. Your job is to hold up God and God's order. And, if we think about pyramids and the symbolism behind them, like that was the Pharaoh. And the Pharaoh is, both God and a person in a certain sense, but they would have seen him as a literal God. But the function there is that this order is not for your sake. It's not good for you. It's what's good for God, what makes God happy, and your own well-being and happiness. It doesn't even enter into the conversation. at all.
Yeah, I think one of the things that strikes us the most when we bump into these stories is the similarities. So that's the thing that we notice. We're like, oh my goodness, here's another story of chaos. Here's in the Egyptian narrative, it'll be told a few different ways. Here's this murky swamp, and here's Amun-Ra sitting on this mount or this mound in the middle, speaking. And you're like, wow, it's like the same story. But just like you pointed out, Josh, it's not the same story, like critical differences. Instead of shalom and goodness and order being birthed out of like this loving, compassionate, gardening almost motif, you have like almost happenstance, like order comes out of chaos, and the rest of us just it's why the world is in so much tension. And you're right, Pharaoh plays this key role. So whenever you're looking in Egyptian hieroglyphs, and I'm far from the expert, but I've been taught by a few different teachers who are, that when you're looking at Pharaoh's name in Egyptian hieroglyphics always appear in what's called a cartouche. And the cartouche is like this rectangular, oval-shaped vault, and it represents the world that you live in. And around that vault, around the cartouche that you and I live in, we would call Earth, are the waters above and the waters below. That's where the gods are. The gods move in a barge that goes. The reason the sun, Ra, the sun god, the reason it rises and then sets is because that barge is going around this cartouche that you live in. And the message of putting Pharaoh's name in the cartouche, the idea is that Pharaoh holds the world together. Like he holds that cartouche open. Because if that cartouche were to collapse, if that cartouche were not to be held open, you'd get waters above and waters below. You'd end up having yourself a big, massive flood on your hands, which I find interesting with the book of Genesis, but I digress. We have Pharaoh holding this cartouche open. So the idea, just like Josh said, you have to support Pharaoh. There are these two different narratives, and they're not the same. They are competing narratives. Go ahead, Josh.
Yeah, one thing that just jumped out to me there is how much the identity of the gods, the reality in their mind of gods, is vested in Pharaoh. And in that sense, we could say like Pharaoh bears God's image. And to me, that's one of the most crucial things that flips, is that we are all, given God's image. And that is the crucial distinction here. Is like Pharaoh is like God. You are nothing.
Right.
And that is probably the most radical thing. I mean, maybe the Sabbath thing is also in there, but definitely like there is a fundamental difference in, how they situate human beings. And, that is crucial to the identity argument that's being had here.
Absolutely.
Now, I'm thinking of more Greek mythology, which is obviously much later than Egyptian, but would like a demigod idea fit with what Pharaoh is, or how do we think about that relationship?
In some ways, I think you could talk about them in similar ways. He's this like human representative of a divine reality. He's as close as you get to a god character on earth. He and his priests, you might even add to that conversation. It is distinct from like the Greek mythology in a lot of ways, but I don't think it's a bad parallel to think of. We often do this with our narrative and with the theology that we create in the ancient world. So I don't think that's unfair at all.
Mm-hmm.
Plenty of conversation about this ahead as we talk about, how does the God that we serve take his people out of Egypt and, flip everything that they know from Egypt on its head.
Right.
And so, we'll be talking about this for a while.
Absolutely. Yeah. So we have Egypt's narrative, which is a narrative of Pharaoh maintaining order, or else, like if Pharaoh's not successful, you'll notice this is a narrative based on fear. It's a narrative based on self-preservation. Like Josh says, that it's the God's interests and then Pharaoh's interests because of that. That's what matters. It's not our interests. Like our interest is to make sure that their interests we're not necessarily in that same, we're in God's narrative. We're like a central character in this beautiful relationship that has a relationship with the created world around it. So God's invitation, as we've already looked at, is an invitation to trust. So you have a narrative of trust, a narrative that sets you free to serve others, where the Egyptian narrative is a narrative of fear that tells you to keep taking care of yourself. And Ray points out at the end of this first video, he says there are two narratives in our world as well, these same two narratives. They're always going to be at play. Whenever you're listening to this podcast, I can guarantee you that the narratives of the world are narratives that are built on fear. That party, that group of people, that whatever, it's a narrative built on fear. If we don't X, then so we have to, versus a narrative of God that says, I've got this. This is my world. I'm just inviting you to help me put it back together. And those are two competing narratives. And so we call this in Bema world, we've decided to call this the tale of two kingdoms. There's always two narratives. There's always two kingdoms. Two kingdoms, the kingdom of empire and the kingdom of shalom. There's a tale of two kingdoms, a kingdom of fear and a kingdom of trust. This is why Egypt becomes a picture and a metaphor for us, because Egypt is this picture of Pharaoh. And we're going to look at that here as the episode continues. But Brent, I remember years ago when we did our first version of this episode, you had pulled a quote from RVL in that first video that I thought was just dynamite.
Yeah, this really like brought it home for me, I think. He said, if you see a culture where life is cheap and sacrifice of others is acceptable to sustain your own obsession with pleasure and entertainment and wealth, you have the wrong story.
Ooh. That one has some zing to it, because that's like, I feel like I live in that world or adjacent to a world that we could describe that way. So,
yeah,
absolutely. So then we move into video 2. Video 2 is called Israel in Bondage. God heard their cry. And the video really starts with Ray trying to show us a little bit about Goshen, like what Goshen was like. Josh, what do you know? Tell us about Goshen.
So this is where Joseph sets up for his family to live after they're reunited. And most of what I know about Goshen, I actually learned from like when I was listening to the podcast, where it was this really incredibly fertile land, but it required nomads to settle it because it was so fertile because it was in like the Nile floodplain. So it would, you'd have to pick up and move all your stuff when the water was higher, and then you would move back in. But it was just like this land would just give and give and give and was incredibly fertile. So in a lot of ways, we see Joseph really setting his family up with a sweet deal in getting them to settle in Goshen. And one thing I want to point out here is that, we've been talking about how Egypt is this like not just a place and a people group and all that, but it's a symbol of empire. And, we see Joseph in his story, he gets right into the heart of empire. He becomes the right-hand man of Pharaoh. And in the way he like helps administrate Egypt, we actually see in some ways him working with empire. Like just read, I think it's in Genesis chapter 47. It literally talks about them settling in Goshen, and then it goes right over and talks about how one of the points it makes is that because he had Pharaoh basically tax the people at like, give us a fifth, give us 20% of your crops for the good 7 years. And then the bad 7 years, everyone had to buy back that excess grain. And it got so bad to the point where literally all of Egypt had to sell themselves into slavery to Pharaoh. Mm-hmm. And Joseph, we could probably pick apart how culpable he is as an individual, but, he's about as high up as you can get. And we can see how this, living life in pursuit of God's story, like it is just because we have faith and are trusting in the story doesn't mean that we are immune to being absorbed in empire. Like there is a very, very subtle sometimes tension and difficult to maintain tension. So Goshen starts as like, Joseph sets up his family with a great deal. Other people are experiencing the hardship. Other people are having to lift up Pharaoh so he can, hold up the sky and make sure that order is maintained. And at first that's at the expense of the Egyptian people who've been going through this famine, and they're, in a lower state. And then, obviously for those familiar with the Exodus narrative, that stuff switches once, a Pharaoh that is a buddy of Joseph is no longer there.
Right.
And scripture says like a Pharaoh arose who forgot Joseph. He's like, I don't know you. What, like you helped out my dad or whatever. Like, I don't know you. Like, get out of here.
Yep.
So Goshen is sweet. Goshen is a really cool place.
Yeah. And I think I think most of us, when we grow up learning the Bible, we think Egypt, we think slavery, we think pyramids, we think desert. And the one thing that we forget about is the Nile. We already talked about this and looked at it in the episode with Avram, where he goes down to Egypt during the famine. You went there because of this rich farmland that was always going to be there and provide. Goshen was this unbelievably rich place. We talked in that episode about that National Geographic article that talked about the richest farmland on the face of planet Earth. Now it's still today 100 feet of farmable topsoil there in the Nile Delta. And this is where you go to settle. You go to settle there, and it is this unbelievable. We don't picture them going to Egypt and having this life of really abundance in a lot of ways. And there's this great moment in the video, if you get to see it, where Ray is standing, and there's just green farmland all behind him, lush, green, incredible. And he gets done talking, and he walks kind of towards the camera. And then as he walks past the camera pans, and it is like a straight line. It is like green, waist-high crops, and then it is desert. And I mean not a blade of grass, not a bush, not a tree. And you walk out into the desert. And Ray's point was, God takes his people from this luscious, amazing, great Egypt out into the desert. And his question was, why does he have to do this? I remember when we did this episode years ago, the first go around before we did the reboot, we had a student with us. His name was Chris Marshall. And during that episode, he said, I just kept thinking of this picture of Ray standing with one foot in like a barley, waist high barley, and then another foot out in desert. And Chris Marshall said, which God, like if you have to look at that picture, which God and which story are you going to choose? Like, which one are you going to look at and say, well, this is order and this is chaos. We're going to pick the wrong story. And I don't think most of us in our world, given the choice, would look at the desert and say, that's where God is. And yet that's what we're going to find in this story. And so another part of the video, Ray says, even when they're not living here, even when it's flood season, Josh just talked about the Nile Delta floods, they like nomadic people to live there because they just pick up their tents and they can move out of the area. A lot of the way that Pharaoh would use, we don't know if he used the Hebrews this way. We don't know anything for sure. But one of the way that Pharaoh would use a lot of these people groups at different points in history is that he would have them build tombs or work on infrastructure while they weren't able to be in. And so actually Ray points out, or I don't know if it was Ray, it was somebody else, has pointed out that one of the inscriptions that they found actually a handful of inscriptions that talk about the Ibiru people. Ibiru. They're like, man, that sounds an awful lot like Hebrew. Is it the same people? Who knows? A lot of scholars think it is. A lot of scholars think it isn't. But these are the kind of people that they would work for Pharaoh. He offered them a middle-class wage. He offered them weekends off. He offered them housing and water, even a meal plan, food provided if he went and worked on his infrastructure and helped him with some of his building projects. That sounds pretty good. Mm-hmm. Sounds like a life that you and I are pretty used to.
And a life that the Israelites perhaps couldn't quite get away from later, right?
Yeah, right, exactly. And that's where Ray goes next. He says, let's look at the book of Joshua. Let's look at the book of Ezekiel. And he quotes these passages that tell us that they were serving the gods of Egypt. I think of the passage in Joshua, throw away the gods your forefathers served in Egypt. Ezekiel will tell us that they were serving gods in Egypt. They had bought into the Egyptian narrative, I think, like many of us would have. They had bought into the wrong story. One of the places I like to take my students is to there's a place in southern Israel called it's Timnah. It's often called colloquially Solomon's Mines. It's not necessarily that Solomon actually had mines there, but they call it Solomon's Mines. And there are these smelting furnaces built into the valley because all throughout the hills, they would mine copper. And so you would take the copper and you would take it into the furnaces, these smelting furnaces to be smelted. Now, Egypt at this point in history is the leading civilization in the world because of metal technology. Like that's how we gauge Brent, what do we call the historical ages? How do we reference them?
Like the Iron Age and the Bronze Age and all those.
Absolutely. We mark the age by the metal technology, because if you had the leading metal technology, you controlled the world. Because what two things, Josh, what two things do we make with metal?
You got to have it for tools, and you got to have it for weapons
and tools. Now, if I have the sharper, not just the sharper, but the stronger sword, if your sword hits my sword and breaks in half, I win. I win. That's an oversimplification, but that's how that works. Mm-hmm. And so they had the leading metal technology. And the reason they had it is because they learned that if you added oxygen to your smelting furnace, you could make a stronger metal. And so they would create these big billows in their smelting furnaces, and they would have slaves jump on these billows to add oxygen to the fire, and it would make a stronger metal. Now, the slaves many of them are not, this is not a long life expectancy job. You are jumping on these billows. You are absolutely expendable. That's just a part of the cost of the imperial narrative. That's what empire looks like, where life is cheap, Brent told us, quoting RVL. And so who's using these tools? Who are the farmers that are using these tools that are made by the Egyptians? It's the Israelites, right? And these Israelites the story has turned, as Josh said earlier. They're now flourishing on the backs of those slaves that were so expendable for the sake of progress. And so God is asking this question. I've heard many authors, I've heard many theologians ask this question. I heard it first from Ray Vander Laan, but Ray's not the first person to ask it. It's been asked by many. It's been asked by Jewish thinkers as well. The question was not, how does God get his people out of Egypt? That will be easy. The question is, how does God get Egypt out of his people? Like, not how does God get his people out of Egypt, but how does God get Egypt when this narrative is so deeply ingrained in your hearts? How do you get your people to leave? They don't want to leave Egypt and go out into the desert. And so God, in a lot of ways, flips the script, I think, as Josh said. He turns it to where all of a sudden we're not working on the backs of somebody else. We are the backs that other people. We are now the slaves. And so this is the narrative. And all throughout Egypt, you see this picture of Pharaoh holding a stick. Sometimes he'll just be like literally holding the stick kind of crisscrossed in his chest. It'll look like a shepherd's crook sometimes. That's the Egyptian symbol of power, of authority. Sometimes he'll be taking a stick and he'll be holding it over people. There's a couple temples in Egypt where on the front facade of the temple, he has a handful of slaves and people groups that he's made his slaves. And he has a stick outstretched. He's beating them. This is coercion. It's a story of coercion. It's imperial power at work. And the Israelites end up finding themselves on the other end of this stick. And so this video ends with Ray saying, God has to go looking for a partner, and he finds Moses. Josh, tell me about the first story, not the birth of Moses, but where's the first time we see like the adult Moses?
Ooh, oh man, this is a dangerous one. I'm going to have to really hold my tongue here. So yeah, we have Moses having learned that he is of Hebrew descent. He is not Egyptian. And at some point he learns this, and the text says that he goes out to see his brothers, his Hebrew family, and he encounters an Egyptian man beating a Hebrew slave. And he is, there's a lot of really interesting rabbinic stuff that I'm not going to say another word about, but this is X marks the spot. Do some digging. I'll do you a favor and tell you that. And he is like, so he just immediately jumps in and strikes the Egyptian who's striking the Hebrew slave, and he dies. And like, there's this instant need to jump in and or to do justice, even if we can question his methods. There's a strong heart for saving this person who is oppressed and being like literally in the Hebrew, the word that's used when Moses strikes the guy and he dies, it's the same Hebrew word for the guy striking the slave. So like this dude is beating a Hebrew slave potentially to death. Like, this is a crazy scene that Moses walks into. And we see, like, even though he's grown up most of his life as an Egyptian, probably maybe is seeing the slave as like a full human being, like takes the blinders off. It's like, whoa, this could be a relative of mine for all I know. And we see that immediately, like, his reaction is to save that person, to act out.
Yeah, so God finds a partner, and he finds it in Moses, like this guy that has his heart.
Mm-hmm.
We looked in the last episode about a God who hears the cry. And on one hand, here's Moses. Like, Moses is a guy, a man who hears the cry of the oppressed and acts.
Mm-hmm.
Like we just looked in the last episode, God hears the cry of the oppressed and he acts. Here's Moses. He hears the cry of he's got the right heart. Now, on the other hand, we might want to say, well, he might need to work on his methods some.
Mm-hmm.
Seems like he's answering violence with violence. He finds somebody beating somebody to death, and he turns around and beats them to death. Like, there's some conversation certainly to be had there. God's going to take him out to the desert to work with Moses on some of these methods. But he does have the heart of God. He hears the cry of the oppressed, and he wants to go use Moses.
Mm. And, I even just had this thought, like, if I was told as an adult, like, hey, we're not actually your parents, you're actually, from this group, like, even Moses' reaction, where his first step is that I'm just going to go out and see what their lives are like. I'm just going to go there. That also feels very God. Like, even back in Babel, God's
sure.
like, all right, I'm going to go down there and see what's going on. I'm going to see for myself.
Yeah, I love that point. Absolutely. Absolutely. Which kind of works. One of my favorite quotes from the episode is when RVL says, God's partnering with Moses, and he's not looking for somebody who will just go give a message. He's looking for somebody who's going to be the message. He's not just looking for somebody that's going to go transfer the right data, tell somebody the truth. He's looking for somebody who's going to go embody the truth and the heart of God. I have made you like God to Pharaoh, Exodus 7 is going to end up saying. We'll look at later. But this is what God is up to. He's a God that hears the cry of the oppressed. Even when they don't, Chris Marshall pointed this out the first time we recorded this episode. The people don't even cry out to God in the story. They don't even call him by name. They just cry out in their oppression. They cry out in their misery. And God doesn't require that they call him by name. He hears their cry. That's who he is. And if you're the one crying, this is really good news. And if you're not the one crying, if you're the one causing the cry, this serves as a warning. And that sets us up for the third video. The third video is called Finger of God, the Plagues. And one of my favorites, not necessarily a whole lot to talk about other than just being able to watch the video if you get a chance. But Ray spends this video pointing out there is a competition between the God of Israel and the gods of Egypt. And it starts even as soon as we find this Moses character who always has, we talked about Pharaoh. Brent, what did Pharaoh have in his hand?
He had a stick.
Always has a stick. Well, Moses always has a stick in his stories, if you've noticed. There's always these stories of sticks, and these sticks represent powers. These sticks represent authorities. These sticks represent the kingdoms, a tale of two kingdoms, Empire and Shalom. There's an imperial stick, and there's a Shalom stick. And they go to war, and oftentimes what we see is these powers being represented by these sticks. In fact, there's a story where Moses goes, and he goes before Pharaoh. And one of the signs that God's given him is that he can throw his staff on the ground, and his staff becomes a snake. So he does that, and the Egyptian magicians, of course, they come in, they throw their staffs on the ground, they become snakes, which raises a whole set of questions for me. But nonetheless, then we're told in the story that Moses' staff or stick eats the other sticks. It doesn't say the snakes ate the snakes. It says the stick ate the sticks, because the author's trying to say this isn't about snakes. This is about sticks. This is about stories. This is about narratives. This is about powers. This is about empires. It's about kingdoms, a tale of two kingdoms. This is a war against the gods. And so Ray will spend a bunch of time talking about the different Egyptian gods. He goes into a temple in the video, and on the temple there are many of the gods, not all of them perfectly, but many of the Egyptian gods of that era on the wall. And he talks about how these 10 plagues of the Exodus story are chipping away at the Egyptian gods. Like I sometimes picture a set of bowling pins, kind of like a pyramid. And he starts at the bottom, and he just starts knocking out a pin, one pin at a time, with every plague. And I love Ray's point in the video. Like Ray points out, he's doing this that the Hebrews will know. Like he says, I'm going to do these plagues that the Hebrews will know. Josh, Hebrew word for know? Talk to us about this.
Oh, beautiful. The Hebrew word for to know is yada.
And what is this yada? Yada, 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 yada? Is that what are we dealing with here?
Well, we have a phrase in the modern English where we talk about to know in the biblical sense, which is, code for carnal relations.
Adam knew his wife Eve and she conceived.
Exactly.
Yes.
Or God wanting to know the hearts of the Israelites during their time in the desert. Like, this is not the kind of knowledge that we think of with, abstraction and omniscience. This is knowledge that is born from direct experience. This is, I'm going to go out there and see for myself what they're doing about. I'm going to go out there and see for myself what the Hebrews are going through. And Moses probably knew how slaves were treated in the abstract.
Yep.
But there was something very different when he saw it up close, when he saw it with his own eyes and was close enough to do something about it, or just stand down and let it happen.
Absolutely.
And that's going to be crucial too. Like when we talk about, especially a lot of the biblical stories that can, sometimes seem like, oh, like why are we doing this? Why didn't God just magically, snap his fingers and do the thing he wanted to do? Or why do this roundabout, little two-step? And a lot of it is so that you can actually know and experience for yourself, not just get a download of the, here's how you get through the desert and get to the place you need to go to. Like, this is not efficiency. In fact, that is how Pharaoh thinks about things. That's how Empire thinks. It's, hey, what if we just had 2 slaves hopping up and down on this giant thing to make the fire hotter so we can make our metal better? And, it doesn't matter that they die. Like, we've got plenty of slaves to keep jumping on it, instead of trying to understand more deeply and to keep in mind, like, there's so much going on in these stories that can change our hearts if we are really, 1, trusting in the story, and 2, there to actually yada and know.
Yes. So God's saying, I want the Hebrews to yada. I want them to experientially know. That's why I'm going to do the plagues. I'm going to do the plagues that they will, not just so that I can defeat the gods one by one and some other, but so that the Hebrews will know. And so you hear that and you think, aha, God's going to war against Egypt. But God says, no, I'm doing this that the Egyptians will know. Mm-hmm. I want the Egyptians to yada that I am God. And you're like, aha, okay. So he's doing this to go to war against Pharaoh. Mm-hmm. And God says, no, I'm doing this so that Pharaoh will yada. Mm-hmm. I will execute judgment, God says in Exodus, on the Egyptian gods. God is going to war against the narrative of Empire. And so when this whole 10 plague story is all over, God says, here's what I want you to do. I want you to take a goat and I want you to tie it up to your house for 5 days. And Ray spends time in the video talking about the problem with that is that the goat is the symbol for Amun-Ra. Mm-hmm. Amun-Ra is the chief god. It's the god at the top of the pyramid. Mm-hmm. This is the last god that God's going to knock out. And so God says, I want you to tie this goat to your house. And on the 5th day, I want you to kill it. And I want you to take its blood. And I want you to wipe it all over your door. Like, you are having to put, if you follow God's instructions, you are taking the chief Egyptian god symbolically. You are killing it and wiping its blood all over. This is a huge step of faith. But what God's doing now is he's giving his people a choice. So there have been parts of the story where God is simply acting. They didn't even have to know his voice. They didn't even have to know his name. They didn't have to cry out to God. They didn't have to cry out to the right. They just had to cry out and God was there. God has shown up. Now God's asking, just like we learned with Avram, God's asking for just a little bit more. I want just a little bit more in this relationship. I want you to step out. I'm going to give you a choice. I want you to step out and say yes to this thing that I'm doing. And it's at this point, if you remember, at the, one video ago, we said, how is God going to get Egypt out of his people? They're finally ready. Mm-hmm. Brent, they're finally ready to leave. After all this, they're finally ready. Enough babies have been thrown in the Nile, enough making bricks, enough elderly abused, enough. They're finally ready to say, I've had it with this Egyptian narrative, at least for now, and I'm ready to go head out into the desert. Mm-hmm. And this is the story. We can't have both.
Yeah.
We can't have both. We can't have both in our world today any more than they could have had in Egypt. There are 2 narratives. There are two kingdoms, there's two empires, and we can't have them both. These two empires today in our own world are built on fundamentally different foundations. They're still built on foundations of fear. They're still built on foundations of self-preservation. And God's story, as always, continues to be built on a foundation of trust and being able to lay down your own agenda, your own life, your own thoughts on behalf of other people. A tale of two kingdoms, my brothers.
And I'm thinking back to your stick conversation and how Moses was told to throw his stick down.
Yeah.
And Pharaoh has his magicians throw their sticks down.
That's
Pharaoh never
point.
throws his own stick down.
Preach it. I love that. Yep.
That's juicy.
You can't hold onto the stick.
God's only letting you borrow. He's only letting you borrow the stick. The stick is his. Yeah, absolutely.
And, man, this is so great because this actually, like, I love the point that you brought up earlier about this isn't about God being like, we gotta go in there and take down this one bad guy. Like, God's always trying to pull out, like, it's like you said, it's empire. That's the only thing God's going to war against. God's okay with the Egyptians repenting and coming with. In fact, some do, and they leave with the Israelites. Yeah. And God would have been fine with Pharaoh repenting and going with them too. And like that thing about God being like, it's about the empire. Like it reminds me of the first episode we did with Babel, where it was like you had this similar thing, you know, this first kind of bump in with organized evil with empire. And again, we see God being like, I'm not just trying to knock things down because I don't like you building, you know, towers or pyramids or any of that stuff. It's not that irrigation is bad. It's not that, you know, the Nile is evil. It's empire has gotten into you, and look at what you are doing with these things and what it has turned you into. And what's really interesting in terms of Egypt as this prolonged symbol, which I think is important, because a lot of times, especially in the biblical narrative, the way they use symbols, it can feel like they're like, that people group, we're going to murder all of them. And sometimes they do mean that, but also like there are a lot of times where it is used symbolically. And what's really interesting is that in that genealogy, right after it talks about Nimrod and his expanding empire, guess who comes right after him in the genealogy?
Oh, stop it.
Mitzrayim.
Yep.
Egypt.
Absolutely.
And God came down and said, okay, we're going to pull out this, you know, the linchpin. And, you know, with Nimrod, we had this image of empire kind of like without any mask, it was just violence and subjugation. And here in Egypt, it's a little bit different. Like we saw, like it starts with, hey, here's a good setup. Here's Goshen. And that, I think, is what makes empire like ever trickier to really to recognize and to resist in our own hearts. And like you said, that's what makes this question of how do we actually get empire out of us, like out of our heart. I hate to break it to you folks, but by the end of this podcast, we will not have a solid answer for you. This is a process. This is something we have to yada. That's the kind of knowledge we need.
The case for discussion groups, Josh. I love it.
Yeah.
The case for community, like wrestling through this tale of two kingdoms, Empire and Shalom. How do we get Egypt out of us? Like this is work. Like this is not something that we can just snap our fingers.
Yeah.
We're not just going to walk across, a dry piece of land that God, like we still have to do work. We still have to spend our time in the desert. We got to figure that out. So check out BamaDiscipleship.com. Look at the groups page, find a group near you, find some people that you can discuss with. Maybe it's just family members. Maybe you can't find anybody else around you. Like whatever it is, like wrestle through this stuff. Like don't let this conversation just pass by and do nothing. Like let this conversation do some work in you. And it doesn't mean you have to change your entire life, but wrestle with this and see where these things are popping up. Everything else is on the website. If you want to get in touch with us, the contact page will give you the most recent way to do that. If you want to make a donation to support our work, like everything we do is made possible by listeners just like you. So yeah, all of that is there on the website. Links to RVL's videos that we referenced today. It's all there. So thanks for joining us on the Bama Podcast. We'll talk to you again soon.
Hi, I'm Mike Scott, a Bama listener and discussion group facilitator in Dumfries, Virginia. And here is a prayer from episode 18's companion. Father God, in a narrative that tells me to look out for myself first, help me to choose your story. In a culture that's too busy to notice the cries of the oppressed, help me to hear them and act. In a world where empire and power reign, help me to trust and find refuge in you and community. We choose your promise over Egypt, trust over fear, shalom over empire. We choose you. Amen.